The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa White. I am CML's Membership Services Manager, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. We're going to learn all about leveraging technology and innovation to help local governments provide broadband services. So great to have you here today. Those of you that are elected officials who have registered will receive 1 university training credit. We are also recording today's webinar, and then we're going to put it on the CML website, cml.org, under training materials. Feel free to access it there if you missed something, or perhaps you want to share a link to the presentation with a colleague who wasn't able to join us today. This will allow you to share this information easily. Probably be online tomorrow morning or afternoon. If you're not familiar with the webinar format, you should see a control panel to the top right of the screen. You have an orange arrow to the left of that panel, which will minimize that entire box. We will be muting you for the webinar, but we certainly encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. Feel free to type in questions throughout the webinar, but we will address questions at the end. So today's webinar, a Learn from the Pros webinar, is presented by a couple of gentlemen from the firm HR Green. We have George Wentz and David Zelenak. George Wentz is the Vice President of Governmental Services Business Line, which offers a comprehensive suite of services to help local agencies function more effectively and efficiently. He brings more than 40 years of administrative, management, and local government-related experience focused on delivering consulting support to public agencies. He has also served as a city manager, assistant city manager, public works director, city engineer, building official, planning director, traffic engineer, and economic development manager. David Zelenak brings more than 25 years of municipal management and engineering experience in Colorado, focusing on transportation engineering, plan review, project management, and implementation of alternative service delivery methods. He is the local governmental services manager for HR Green. He played a key role in installing more than 400 miles of new municipal-owned fiber optic infrastructure in a number of Colorado cities. He also formed several regional coalitions that work collaboratively with municipal staff on ITS, telecom, and streetlight initiatives to promote more operational and cost-effective efficiencies while protecting city interests via rate case analysis, stakeholder meetings, and public-private partnerships. So clearly you are in very good hands with our presenters today. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. George, who's going to kick off the presentation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time and energy that's been put into this presentation today, and welcome everyone that's on the webinar today. Let me just start by talking briefly about just who we are. And Lisa, do you have control on your end?
Nope, you have it, sir.
I got it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Well, let me talk briefly about HR Green. And you've heard a brief introduction, but HR Green has been in the business now for over 100 years. I guess the key point is we focus much of our work effort with local governments. And our key desire is to bring the technology and support the local government and to help them in any way possible, particularly in some of the disciplines you see here on the screen. As was mentioned, my key role is within governmental services, and governmental services focuses its attention on local government specifically. Dave and I have been in this industry a long time, but we try to keep very current with all of our technology so that we can support our local government clients and agencies the best we can. Frankly, we offer whatever information we can, whether you're a client or not, and hope that you take advantage of the knowledge base that we have open to you. As I mentioned, David in particular leads our local government services operations within Colorado. I have key responsibility for the Western United States, and most of our activity is within California and within Colorado. Our agenda briefly today covers numerous topics. And as you can see, those topics cover everywhere from technology to legislation, legal aspects, as well as talking about the infrastructure itself, and also how you can take advantage of funding and deal with your particular infrastructure to your benefit. So as you look ahead, we will also provide you with a roadmap of how to, we believe, effectively address some of the key needs within your local government. So we're going to be rushing here forward rather quite quickly to take about the next 45 minutes to identify 45 key things for you to think about. Urban centers and these fortresses that you've seen, Frank, in the past, are being replaced by urban centers. This is an actual scene within the Denver metro area of a fortress mall that's being replaced by the latest urban center look. As you can see, it's very welcoming, and the goal is to make it a destination for folks to come into and to spend their time at. So you will see more and more of a new look, and having been and being in economic development, we see the changes within industry itself as well. So with that, you can see that about 12% of our total retail sales now, in fact, are going online. And an example of what's happening is like within Kohl's, they're now working with Amazon to deal with the return and frankly purchase of merchandise through that Amazon network. So David, I'm going to be turning it over to you now, as you can see, some thinking that has changed over time.
Well, George, thank you very much. And again, it's a real pleasure. Lisa, thank you, and Megan, and everybody here at CML for the great opportunity to share with so many of our colleagues and friends in cities and counties across the state, not just about broadband, really, but putting some context around this. Really, what's changing in the world around us, and maybe helping to answer the question: why is broadband so important? Although, as we see it, it's an important piece of a much bigger pie. And so, as George said, so it's the end of the line for fortress malls. You saw the streets at South Glen there in the South Denver metro area. It looks nothing like it did just 10 years ago. But I would also offer, with these changes in technology, and we'll talk about these briefly, yes, broadband is a big part of it, but really, again, the bigger picture is what else may be changing, what else are we seeing dying off in the next several years. Road widening projects, we'll talk about autonomous vehicles and cars a little bit, privately owned vehicles. If vehicle ownership changes, do you need to buy as many cars? What about car dealers? What about parking garages, parking lots and runoff? Mass transit is at the end of the line for the billion-dollar light rails that I know so many of us have worked so hard at putting together here in the Denver metro area. But if the technology changes, and it's not that far away, 2040 is what a lot of the experts are saying, will we need as many gasoline stations? What about the gas tax if we go, some are saying, full electrification by 2040? What about a three-car garage? If car ownership drops, who needs a three-car garage anymore? Who needs a two-car garage? And then congestion will change dramatically and profoundly, in some cases up, because car utilization will go up, they're saying, but car ownership will drop like a rock. And so those are all say goodbye to's, but say hello to, isn't that cute, electric cars and car parts. Self-driving buses, getting to large, dense city centers like downtown Denver, where you need to have 100,000 people per hour or more. Really, what we see coming online is some terminology, and so pardon the acronyms. V2V is a term that's being used very common now. It's vehicle to vehicle, so that's when cars talk to each other, and V2I, a vehicle to infrastructure. So you have a lot of work going into vehicle to vehicle, a lot of work going into vehicle to infrastructure. 5G, we have the 3G and 2G and LTE cell phones, but really we're a few years away from the 5G transformation. That'll be as profound a change, we'll talk about that here in a few minutes, as it was from the old flip phone to the first smartphone that we saw a whopping 10 whole years ago. But along with 5G phones, will come street light transmitters and 300-foot spacing for cell towers. Incredibly, is what the laws of physics requires 5G to do. And then if you're in the traffic signal business, something called parametrically and dynamically controlled traffic signals, if you even imagine that you need traffic signals in the future. So looking at where the future is going, it's definitely changing. And then throughout all this, the one common theme, the one backbone, quite literally, will be fiber optic cables. It could be fiber into your utility meters, could be fiber to the premises, which is broadband being provided by your city government. It could be fiber between your infrastructure nodes, such as your traffic signals. But clearly, fiber will have a key role through all this, and broadband certainly as well. What's driving the change? You know, there's so many changes going on now. I wish we had an hour to spend on each one of these slides. Number one is what we're seeing is people are now becoming sensors themselves. And if you think about the Waze or Google Maps, so many people are inputting now, wow, there's a traffic jam on 225. Well, that's you are becoming a sensor. Beyond that, there's what's being called both, yes, urbanization, where we see the tower cranes in downtown Denver. I don't know, Lisa, there must be 17, 18, 19 tower cranes in downtown Denver with urbanization, but there's also Uberization. In other words, it's a shared economy. Yes, you can take an Uber car, but beyond that, you can do bike sharing, which we have now here in Denver. And so many other things, kind of like time sharing going on steroids. But there's the Uberization and the urbanization of our world. People are now much more willing, mostly, to share data than they ever have been. A huge explosion in the data itself, and we'll talk about why broadband is a piece of that. Everybody now has got a mobile device. Broadband, by one study that I saw, is seeing a 43% annual increase in demand. So imagine that you had a savings account and you're getting a 43% increase in your interest rate every year. Well, year over year, you can set your watch by it. It's 43% increase in demand for broadband. Something called cross-sector dynamics. That's where you never would think about different sectors of our economy now being relied upon to help each other out, and of course increasing expectations. So there's a lot of changes going on out there. The doggone cell phone again, yeah, can you believe it just turned 10 years old, the smartphone? 10 years ago, the smartphone did not exist. What else is changing? Since 2013, many of you know about Senate Bill 152 exemptions. The number, I think, Lisa, thanks in large part to CML getting the word out and supporting their city governments out there. I happen to be part of one of the first, the state's first major cities to pioneer that. I spent a number of years in Centennial, and as many of you may now know, historically, way back 4 whole years ago, Centennial was, I think, by some accounts, the second major city in the state to do its 152 exemption, in part at my urging, and a large number of other staffers and people in the community. But since 2013, the number kind of looks like this. It's now about 114 total cities, counties, school districts, and even some special districts have exempted themselves from 152. And that, of course, simply allows you to enter into agreements for using broadband and fiber optics. What else is changing? Sensors and dashboards are becoming really very important. I mentioned the Waze application. If people are sensors, it's crowdsourcing is the term. Beyond that, though, data sources for Waze, and this is again talking more about sensors and dashboards. If you're driving up and down I-25 and you're looking at your cell phone, yeah, you're picking up data that's from some CDOT owns some in-pavement detectors. Would you believe in the tech center there are Bluetooth detectors where they are, if you have your Bluetooth device on your cell phone, you're helping contribute to the overall traffic congestion picture. Wi-Fi is now coming in. It's more granular, but it works a lot like Bluetooth. If you have your phone on Wi-Fi, you have your phone on Bluetooth, those can be received and used. Thanks for sharing that data. CDOT does own some overhead microwave detectors. GM, you know, they have those OnStar devices in their cars. Would you believe 12% now is the number of vehicles out there that are contributing through OnStar? And where the GM cars are all going, that contributes to these Google Maps pictures. Cell phones, obviously, and a lot of citizen tweets, but I'd just like to give a shout out here to our folks in Colorado Springs. I actually helped participate in one of the first ever in the nation actual implementations by Waze of what turns out to be rerouting people not just around today's cone zones. In other words, people with sensors, hey, there's a slowdown on I-25, but you can now proactively input into the system tomorrow's cone zones. And this is a real live screenshot from a bike race that was held in the Springs this past summer, where all those cone zones, actually they were street block offs, were pre-input into the system. So huge kudos goes to Colorado Springs for doing that, Waze for allowing the Springs to be the first beta site for doing that. But when it comes to looking at cell phones now, everybody's concerned about that. Do you think cell phone messages are becoming a big deal? If you saw the news over the weekend, you can just ask Hawaii about the importance of, if you didn't see that, some folks in Hawaii had some threats of incoming missiles reported through their cell phones. Yes, it was a huge false alarm. And so you can look at this as a good thing, a bad thing. Certainly cell phones, dashboards, sensors, all these things are really come together. Again, the common thread here is telecommunications, and what drives that is fiber optics. Some more changes that we see coming up here. I mentioned earlier a change from LTE, or long-term evolutionary is the telecommunications term for that, to 5G. It's fair to say 5G standards aren't actually even written yet. We know they're coming, but when you look at the laws of physics, as I said earlier, to get the kind of throughput, broadband throughput through your cell phone is going to require, just the laws of physics, a transmitter. Can you imagine a cell tower roughly about every 300 feet versus every 3 miles that we have right now? And every one of those transmitters will largely require fiber optic feedback. So as we look at it, yeah, fiber optics are going to be needed much more dramatically, much more importantly in the future than they have been today, and they're huge today. But using fiber, you can create revenue if you're a city. You can use fiber if you start thinking about this now to control aesthetics. And what about abandonment of those big mega sites, as they're called, in favor of these smaller ones? That's all what we see coming down the pike, as they say. More talk for a few minutes here about mobile weather sensors. Some of the technologies are going, and I know the I-70 corridor, CDOT's putting a lot of time and effort into vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure improvements along the I-70 corridor, where, yeah, there's an Audi. I wish that were my Audi, but that Audi actually has a sensor which is measuring the coefficient of friction and the pavement conditions going on right now. What's interesting is, as you look forward into the world of autonomous or self-driving vehicles, and those are two distinctly different terms, by the way, what's going to be required if you're going to be able to run cars at 86 miles an hour, 4 inches apart, northbound I-25, and yes, that's what they're talking about, you're going to need to have hypergranular, ultra-detailed sensing of how much skid resistance, because if you're moving cars 4 inches apart, 86 miles an hour, northbound I-25, you need to be able to predict reliably that you can stop those cars and do it safely. And the only way to do that, the one missing link that frankly doesn't exist, is sensing the pavement conditions. And along with that, they're saying really that the one big question mark right now is, how do you do friction measurements, and how can you do that? Well, would you believe, again, back to this, it sounds like a broken record, broken CD, fiber. Now, what's coming down the pike, brand new technology just off the shelf. In fact, I was asked to be the keynote speaker at the annual Fiber Optics as a Sensor Association, FOSA, where they're actually figured out ways now they can use the fiber optic cable not just for conveying the telecommunications, we call it the ones and zeros, but minute changes in strain of the fiber optic strand itself can be a huge indication of what's going on. For example, you put fiber below an asphalt pavement surface, you can detect, hey, there goes a 62,000-pound truck. It's northbound at 47 miles per hour, and it's in the third lane over. We're talking really about hypergranular sensing, not just of pavements, but also through fiber optics being used now as sensors themselves. And that's whole new technologies coming out. Here's a CSU Rams parking lot sensor. I just want to throw this in here to talk about. There's a lot of cool applications for telecommunications and pavements and parking lot sensors. But as cool as that CSU Ram is on that the hockey puck sensor in the pavement, it's probably soon to be overshadowed by, again, more fiber optics as sensors. Lay these things in your parking lot, and you can tell where your open spaces are very cheaply. By the way, a strand of fiber optic goes for roughly 1 penny per strand per foot. So a 5,000 foot long strand of fiber optic cables will be about 5,000 pennies, $50 gets you a mile of fiber optic cables. Incredibly cheap, by the way. The demand for fiber is through the roof right now. We're seeing a minimum 6 months delay for a major fiber optic purchase. So you need to be thinking ahead if you're going to be doing any fiber optic acquisition in the future. So one last quick detour here, talking briefly about driverless vehicles, by the way, are different than autonomous. A driverless vehicle has no steering wheel. And so if you say, wow, the future of our traffic system will kind of maybe look like this, well, maybe you're right. Do we need traffic signals in the future where we have vehicles to vehicles talking, V2V? You have vehicles talking to the infrastructure, and the answer is you may not even need traffic signals in the future if you have a totally managed system. That is, every car talks to every other car, they talk to the infrastructure, and the infrastructure determines on a totally managed system basis who can go where and why and how fast. So here's a cute little graphic that I like using a lot. So okay, so what's the big deal? Okay, again, telecommunications, driverless cars, where's this all going? Well, on the left there is a cute little, they call them platoons of driverless cars. I mentioned, okay, you're 4 inches apart, 86 miles an hour northbound. So what's the big deal with something like that? Well, when you look at what are we doing now, transit, and I love the RTD, I take it whenever I can. Maybe 5% of total trips are offloaded from our network. 5% maybe are offloaded by mass transit. And RTD does a great job. Colorado Springs people likewise. 5% maybe out of busing people around. Carpools, actually maybe 5%. I didn't come here to CML today in a carpool. I drove myself, but about 1 in 20, about 5% maybe out of carpooling. Believe it or not, telecommuting is pretty effective. We're seeing 10%, maybe 20%. You know, I may not work on Friday. Maybe I'll work alternate Thursdays. I'll work from home. Telecommuting is actually very effective at 10 to 20%. So add these up, 5 plus maybe 20, so you get 30% increase in capacity by transit, mass transit, carpooling plus telecommuting. Telecommuting gives you maybe 30%. Any idea what this transformational technology will give you? Driverless capacity with a totally managed system. They're talking about as much as 300% increase in capacity. So 1 lane on I-25, theoretically, totally managed system, maybe 20 years out there. 1 lane can handle what 3 lanes, 300% increase in capacity. And that's why maybe we can stop or look differently at road widening projects. What's scary to me is that they're talking about having 10% driverless cars by 2025. There's a Deloitte study out that talks about 80%, and that's full implementation. By the way, 80% of the people with smart cell phones went from the dumb flip phone smart cell phone to the smart cell phone. That change in technology took about 9 years to full implementation. So they're saying now the 80% adoption point is full implementation 2040. And we don't own the rights, by the way, to the Seinfeld show. But remember the soup Nazi? No soup for you. I actually went backwards in time and looked at the no soup for you guy is as far backwards in time as this point is in the future. That was 23 years in the past. 23 years from today, we will be at full implementation, according to some experts, of this autonomous and driverless standard. So what about your plans? Where's this going? Are the cogs embracing these massive changes that are 23 years in the future? Maybe not so much. One last quick deep dive here. Parking garages. What if you had a parking garage and you could park the car 1 inch from the next car and 1 inch from the next car? Because you don't have to open doors because the cars park themselves in the garage. So suddenly your parking garages, if you even say that, why would you want to pay for parking when you can send your car off to run an errand for you? Or why would you even want to do that when you can have your car go park itself in front of grandma's house in the neighborhood 3 miles away? Or what the heck, send your car for a joyride down I-25 and go clog the freeway. You may not need parking as we now know it. So there's profound impacts. With autonomous cars, yeah, you can send your car home. Can you drunk drive? Are you driving drunk if you're not driving your driverless car? What about revenue drops? Is it the end of mass transit? And really, what they're saying is that highways like I-25 essentially become train tracks. And that's why we're saying that you may not need the mass transit technologies as we now know it if you're going with these driverless cars. Reduced accidents. Is there a reduced need for ambulances, for reduced need for fire stations? What else don't we know? You know, the impacts of this stuff is so profound I really can't impress enough upon all of you about what dramatic changes are coming, and by some accounts, is driving now soon to become a distraction to texting. That's something to think about. So with that, George, we'll turn it back over to you to talk about smart cities and technology integration.
All right. 1 minute, George.
Thanks. Go ahead. Thanks, David. I really appreciate the time that's being spent, and as you can tell, we're focusing a lot of attention on what can certainly be coming in the future. I want to take just a moment or two to talk about some management considerations as it relates to smart cities. As we all know, smart cities has been defined in a lot of different ways and is very specific to a particular agency. So the level of implementation of the smart city concept certainly varies from agency to agency. And as you look at this particular slide, there's a lot of detail, and again, you'll be happy to know we'll share all this information with you. But the important takeaway here is that we're really trying to emphasize that you really need to have and encourage intergovernmental thinking. And the goal would be to optimize your return on investment, whatever level the implementation is of broadband within your particular agency. So with that, let me just also talk for a brief moment about smart cities from the perspective of interconnection of your systems. Dave has talked a lot about some of the intermodal type of transportation coming, and you're going to hear in a couple of minutes much more about how that applies to your infrastructure and elements that you should be taking seriously as you think about how you're going to be implementing that technology within your particular organizations. Some of the things to look at is what's coming in the future and some of the advancements that have been made within the technology itself. In the past, the traditional coax or wire type systems had certain capacities, generally in the range of 20 to 40 megabytes per second. And now the single fiber that you can see in the illustration in the image to the right, one of those strands now in itself can carry well over 1,000 megabytes per second. And that impacts our thinking a lot. Historically, back in about 15 years ago, signal basically on one strand, but now you're looking at that single strand being carried to like 5,000 households in terms of its particular capacity. So as you can tell, there's more and more cities investing in that particular technology, and it seems like that's really good thinking as you think about smart cities and the implication that it has. David mentioned earlier some of the cities that in fact have been investing in it, and you can tell that more and more cities are coming on board to do just that. So the real question is whether or not you have the technology, and are you ready, and are you doing all that you can as it relates to that technology. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to David to talk a little bit more how that technology implicates your agencies.
George, thanks again. So yeah, talking about little technology, just a little telecom 101 here. Some of you may have noticed that about 2 years ago, the FCC redefined, they defined what broadband is as 25 megabits download and 3 megabits upload. And so if you do or don't have 25 and 3, you do or don't have broadband under the most recent FCC definition. And by the way, just a little aside here, there's a lot of talk now about the current FCC under the new administration redefining back downward to some other number. That's a whole other discussion, frankly. But for right now, the FCC definition of broadband is 25 down and 3 up. And so by this standard, about half of us don't even have broadband today. There are a number of gigabit cities out there, about 100 of them. Austin, Kansas City, Chattanooga, Santa Monica. Longmont, by the way, has a distinction of, I've seen one instance where Longmont has been recognized as being the #1 fastest city in the nation in terms of being a true gigabit speed. Gigabit, by the way, is when you've got 1,000 megabits down and 1,000 megabits up. So it's called symmetrical gigabit. And if you've got, let's say, 30 megabits now, that's pretty typical through coax. You're increasing the speed by 30 times, and yet, can you believe the price often drops to between $50 and $70 a month? So you're paying about half the money for 30 times the speed. And just roughly, this is very bad, very rough math, but Longmont will probably plateau at about 20,000 local government or 20,000 citizen customers, and they're charging about $50 a month under their most common plan. And so it's very simple math: $50 times 20,000 customers. Longmont's monthly gross revenue is about $1 million per month, or $12 million a year in gross revenue. Can be very lucrative if you're careful, if you've got the background. By the way, just for kicks and grins and giggles, one good site to go to is speedtest.net. I tested mine recently. I got a whopping 2 megabits download and 2.99 megabits upload. The numbers vary all the time, but I'd encourage you, see what you have at home, see what you have at work, and most likely maybe you're in the 20s or 30s, but you're probably not in the thousands unless you're on a gigabit speed. I mentioned before what's driving broadband changes, 43% increase in growth rate. Interestingly, the technologies do exist out there to support the demand. It's simply a matter of having fiber optics to support the demand that's out there. Many of the incumbents find it very, very difficult, or they're unwilling to invest in the upgrades. By the way, some of the net neutrality stuff, actually, some people are saying that happened 2 weeks ago, may either set back or give cities like Longmont some advantage, because they don't have to play by the same rules of net neutrality if they aren't part of that overall incumbent jungle out there. In terms of where this is going, television, we had channels 2 through 13 not too many years ago. Then we go to HD TV, 4K TV is on the horizon, followed soon by 8K TV. And I mentioned earlier cell phones. We're going through 2G, 3G, we'll be at 5G before too long. That's what's driving this. The demand is certainly there, the technology is there, the devices are there, but again, what's lagging years behind in many cases is the fiber optic infrastructure. Enter in Google Fiber about 3 or 4 years ago. That was a game changer for a lot of cities. Broadband is now being seen as the fourth utility. Utility companies, municipal utilities, and co-ops. Here in Colorado, we've got about 30 co-ops, about 30 munis, and a variety of, they call them for-profit entities, or IOUs, investor-owned utilities, but combined, not so much on the investor-owned utilities, but we're seeing a lot of co-ops and a lot of the munis starting to look seriously at investing in broadband. I mentioned 110 cities and counties now. What's driving that? Again, the incumbents. People are saying, hey, the incumbent service now, it's slow speed, it's high prices, it's bad service. Those networks may be years away. Some cities are saying, we want to look at broadband because the economic development piece. There's high-tech businesses that we know we can attract. Again, back to Longmont, you look at Digital Globe has pulled in thousands of jobs to Longmont, in part, arguably, because of their incredible fiber optic connections. So we're seeing many, many jobs going where the fiber connections are. People want to work from home, and a lot of entrepreneurs. It's true that if you're a United Launch Alliance, you're a huge global enterprise. The fact that you can get a gigabit broadband for $50 a month is not going to be a major decision factor in large firms. But if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a small firm, and you'd be asked to pay $1,000 a month for what you can get in Longmont, $50 a month, you might find them going to your city. A lot of talk now about the digital divide and a 1-to-1 ratio between laptops and students. And you're seeing a lot of schools getting involved and partnering now with cities around them and looking for ways of partnering with other agencies to help with closing that digital divide. Here's a picture I took in San Antonio, Texas. I'm driving down just a neighborhood residential street, and you start seeing these signs, house for sale, house for sale. But more important than the house for sale sign is the houses that have fiber optics now have 2 signs in their yards. Come buy my house, and by the way, buy my house because it's a fiber optic powered home. Interestingly, we'll talk about that in a minute here, but on average, you're seeing about a 3%, in some cases a 5% increase in value to homes. So a $300,000 home, you could see a 3 to 5% increase in value, maybe $10,000, $15,000 increase in value because you've got a $1,000 piece of fiber optic cable going into it. So give me 1, I'll give you 10 back. Is a pretty good deal when it comes to property values. Citizen service, and then as I mentioned with Longmont, there's some incredible revenue potential that if you're a city, it's definitely worth looking at. And then the long game, as George mentioned, is really positioning yourself for the smart city of the future. All these technologies, all the stuff going on there. What I'd love to remind many of our city government clients is, believe it or not, you're already very well pre-positioned. If you think about it, what you already have out there, you probably have some traffic signals. Pretty likely that not all of them, but probably some of them have some fiber optic connections. That's a picture in the lower left there of a picture I took in Centennial of a Centennial traffic signal. We'll talk about Centennial specifically, but a lot of talk, a lot of money going in. By the way, it's kind of free money to cities. Dr. Cog, Pikes Peak Area Council of Governments, CDOT, Federal Highway Administration pouring in billions into cities to help them improve their traffic signals, and there's tons of excess capacity from those fiber optic strands that you can get for free from the feds, which you can then repurpose for other uses. And that's kind of how we got started in Centennial. Utilities are doing a lot of work now. SCADA is a fancy term for their big pumps and pipes controller systems. But we're seeing a lot of work also with automatic meter reading and automated metering instrumentation. They call those AMR, AMI systems. But we'll talk about metering here in just a minute here. Street lights, wow, the world of street lights, this is not your grandma's street light, and we got a slide on that in the future here coming up. And public rights of way and a lot of IGAs. The bottom line is there's plenty of existing public fiber around there. Yeah, it doesn't go everywhere you need to, but when you start thinking about who owns what fiber, it's not just the cities, it's the utilities, it's in some cases the school districts, and in some cases it is the incumbent providers, who, by the way, may be required to allow you to have access. They won't tell you that, but they may be required under the PUC rules to give you access to the privately owned fiber optics. So you may not even need to install miles of fiber in your city if you can piggyback on what's already out there. One last point I'd like to make here is that what we often find is that conduit is actually, there's a saying in some circles, the tail is bigger than the dog. Well, in this case, the conduit, which is just plastic pipe in the ground, may be 90% of the cost of your telecommunications system if it's an underground system. And that's one thing that we like to point out. So do you have old pipe? Can old pipe be repurposed into having both electricity conductors and fiber optic? And the answer is absolutely yes. So you need not put in huge investments necessarily into new conduit to fiberize your city. Here's a picture I took up in Vail not too long ago. Actually, the Greg Hall, who's the Public Works Director in Vail, scolded me. He says, "Dave, that picture there is so last year. They've upgraded them from these top hats, but they've got 29 streetlights. I think they're approaching 30 streetlights now in Vail, which are fiber optically connected and throwing out. It's not broadband because it's not fast." But it's 4 megabits per second of Wi-Fi, but it's free. And if you're in downtown Vail Village, you get the 29 city streetlights are now throwing out free Wi-Fi signals to, they don't call them tourists, they're their guests in Vail. But what's important about that is that I mentioned that 5G, the new standard, yeah, it probably won't exist for several years, but when it does come out, it will require thousands of transmitters. 300-foot spacing is what we're seeing at a whopping 59 gigahertz is the frequency, very, very high frequency. And the perfect backbone, again, is fiber, and more fiber, whether it's through street lights, through your traffic signals, through your utility meters. Every inch of fiber is like gold of the future. So I mentioned that's not your grandma's street light anymore. I won't go into a lot of the details on what street lights can do, but I would say that there is there's a large effort. I know, Lisa, you folks here at CML are doing a lot of work helping cities understand the benefits, the pros, cons, and costs of municipalizing their street lighting. And this has been going on now for 5, 6, 8 years, for quite a while, with one of the large incumbent electric providers. 15 to 20 bucks a month is pretty typical for a 100-watt light bulb. And the question is, okay, in a 100-watt light bulb, how much of that 15 to 20 bucks a month really goes to power the electricity behind that? And the answer, would you believe, it depends on the light bulb, but $2 to $4 a month out of your, let's say, 20 bucks a month is actually going into paying the cost to run that light bulb. Cities, I'd be glad to share offline some of the details and kind of what's going on there. There's a number of NDAs circulating around there now, but I would say in general, cities who are looking at, and there are several right now that are looking at actually well down the road doing this, are seeing a 5 to 10 year return on investment. Very definitely worth doing. And then beyond just buying them out for the revenue savings, the cost avoidance standpoint, because it's the right thing to do. You can reduce energy consumption, you can save money. But beyond all that, again, it's the smart city thing that George talked about. It's positioning your city for the wave of the future. And then once you buy the streetlights, then you fiberize it, and then you can sell the rights to it in 5 years for when those 5G people come knocking at your door. I mentioned earlier, yes, there's now room in electrical conduits for fiber optics. And the bottom line here, the foot stomping point of this whole slide here is, if you're a city and you do not now own your streetlights, number one thing, get some help. Start looking at purchasing those streetlights out from whoever you're paying your 15 to 20 bucks a month for. Stop the brain damage, stop the bleeding. A quick word about smart utility meters and kind of what's going on there. I mentioned automatic meter reading. That's where somebody drives or walks around the street with a little radio receiver, and your meters typically now are throwing out signals. It depends on the technology. Every several seconds, maybe every minute or so, there's a little beep, 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 says Grandma used 1,000 gallons of water yesterday. And those are pretty common systems. But oddly enough, the batteries wear out in those about every 7 years. And so about every 7 years, they have to go in there and replace those. And so I would offer, rather than replacing them with simply another radio frequency transmitter, which works very well, they're very reliable, and they're definitely worth doing, look now at what role can or should fiber optics play in a meter changeout. It's $200 to $500 per meter, which you're going to pay anyway. But is it worth thinking now, positioning your city to put fiber optics into every meter that you have at every house? And then if you do, how do you allocate the cost? Does the utility pay for that? Does the general fund pay for that? Does CDOT pay for that? Or do you just do nothing and allow the wave of technology to bypass you? Any one of these is fine, but I'm just saying there's a tremendous opportunity in fiberizing every home in town. And if you can get the utility people to help pay for that, so much the better. Quick word about sensors and what they can do. This is arguably the streetlight of the future. There's a term, everybody's heard the term cloud. There's a term I hadn't heard much of called either the edge computing or fog computing. But a lot. This is an example here of fog computing going on with a well-censored streetlight. And so what the picture shows up here is, yes, you can have a fiber optic cable coming up to it, but rather than sending in huge amounts of data, which you can very easily through fiber, as George said, you can do a lot of the processing now at the streetlight itself and only send up through the system change detection. So you can detect gunshots, vehicle congestion, signal malfunctions, using fiber as a sensor, detect aging pipelines. You can use them as sniffers when there's smoke around, flood warnings, you name it. But the streetlights really are the sensors of the future. What good is a sensor, though, without a dashboard and without taking action? A lot of work's going into, okay, so we put out these sensors there, so now what? What do you do with the data from there? What we're finding is that citizens usually don't care a lot about citywide alerts, but if you can personalize the information that your city sensors give your citizens, for example, is the congestion bad now around my kid's school? Can you do self-defining, like on the Waze system? Can you define what's important to you? And the answer is yes, if you have sensors, if you have the telecommunications backbone, and if you've got the dashboard systems in place, you can allow people to even personalize their own dashboards. Is I-25 congested? Are the schools with the snow going on today? What's it look like out there, and how can I use the data that's out there to my advantage? So the last part I'd like to talk about here briefly is, okay, so if smart cities are inevitable, what can I really do today to position my city for this huge wave that's about to this tidal wave coming over us? Number one, you've heard me say fiber is, pun intended, is the common thread. It's lacking today. It really is under your control. You can do a lot of this today. It's amazingly low cost, high impact, and we've seen some returns. One municipal dollar going in can give you easily, comfortably $20 or more back out in terms of benefit to cost ratio. So again, telecom and infrastructure are absolutely crucial. A few quick slides here about some of the work we did in Centennial, and kudos to those people for doing an extraordinary job. Back in 2010, I helped structure the Centennial's first ever IGA for fiber optics. It's Arapahoe Road is where that red line shows 96 strands. We worked in IGA with CDOT and used a lot of Dr. Cog money. I don't think there was any city money in this one at all. Every green dot, though, on the map is a traffic signal location. And so we said, we're going to use other people's money to put in fiber to the city. And we're also going to go beyond that now and get some more other people's money and try to work out some deals with some of the installers and see what we can do. And that's, would you believe, just 4 to 5 years later. That's what the system looked like after a couple of years of really fiberizing the city of Centennial. Depending on how you value that, if you value the fiber at $20 per foot, and we figure it was about $2 a foot on average to install it, you put in $600,000 of city cash, out pops an investment valued at least $6 million. That's a 10 to 1. Maybe it's worth 10 million, maybe it's worth 20 million. It really is worth whatever it is. But the point is, this is not that hard. You can do it. You can start right now. And yes, there are firms, I'll put a little plug in here, firms that can help you down that road. We've done it. We know a lot about this. A lot of what we did in Centennial was, in the technical term, joint build, piggybacking, dig once policies, a lot of co-locations, a lot of work. But the essence of it really is that when there's an installer out there putting in fiber optic cable, the first conduit costs about $20 a linear foot to put in the ground. In some cases, we did 2 or 3, call it a piggyback installation. Centennial would pay the 100% of the additional charge, or the delta, was paid for by the city. Often that was $1 for the pipe and $1 to put it in, so $2 a foot, and we got many dozens of miles of this stuff for pennies on the dollar. That's kind of what we did. The results, by the way, forcing a lot of this underground, they're cutting a lot fewer streets now in Centennial than they used to. Less potholes, less congestion, a lot more sharing of infrastructure. Would you believe the private sector investment, the #1 employer, the last I saw in Centennial, is one of the large telecommunications providers. They're still very robust. Incumbents are still improving service. And a company you probably never heard of called Ting is now actually installing a commercial network over top of much of the backbone that we built just 2, 3, 4 years ago, is now being spun off and used commercially by a large company called Ting. Very minimal cost to the city, and property values, would you believe, in Centennial, I think, have never been higher. So much like much of the overall area. What else can you do today? We'd like to break it down very briefly here in the time remaining into 4 very simple, short steps you can do. Immediate, short-term, mid-term, and long-term. These are things you can do right now based on our experience and the value of doing this. Overall, one common theme is you can't have too much fiber. You may not need it today, you may not need it next year, but the stuff doesn't spoil. By the way, the first thing you can do, a quick shout out to our fine folks in Manitou Springs. Would you believe it? We're hopefully on the verge of working a deal using the state's first ever abandoned water pipe in Manitou as a fiber optic conduit. The deal's not done yet. We've got a lot of work to do, but we're helping Manitou repurpose a water pipe for a fiber optic conduit, so you don't have to pay the $20 a foot or even $2 a foot. It's already there. So you can update your public policies. You can develop these, we call them fiber-friendly policies. The city council can pass, or even the public works director, city engineer, can often develop a co-location program by herself or himself. You can look at this streetlight municipalization initiative that we talked about. That's for real. Look at your street cut program. You know, when I was in Colorado Springs, I spent, I don't know, Lisa, 15 years as Director of Public Works in Colorado Springs. One thing that we did down there was we really brought to a grinding halt this latent subsidization of utility street cutters. So the guys would come in here, would send an inspector out, and then the pothole forms, and the city patches the pothole. Well, it wasn't my pothole, it was their pothole. It was Tuesday. No, it was last August. No, enough is enough. We brought the subsidization to a grinding halt. And I think in the Springs, the total number that I recall reporting to City Council was about $1 million, sounds like Austin Powers, $1 million a year in new revenues to help repair the streets. So you can do that right now. You can update your management systems. Greenwood Village, I'll give them a shout out. They probably have one of the state's toughest, in a good way, underground utility requirement, where every inch of every utility can and arguably should be mapped in 3 dimensions in your GIS system at no expense to your city. So if Larry, the pipe installer, comes in and says, I want to put a pipe under Arapahoe Road and I'm going 11,000 feet, you can make Larry, the installer, give you in 3 dimensions a graphic, a shape file, it's called, for your GIS system. So you know not just, okay, it starts here and ends over there, but this pipe goes 11.2 inches down, 3.6 inches to the left of that valve box, and all the way through. Every inch of that can be mapped at no cost if you require them to. And these are the kind of public policy updates that take a little time, but they're practically free and can have some amazing results. Secondly, short term, can you create some community fiber? Again, that's the Centennial map again. You would strongly suggest look at identifying all of your fiber optic related assets. Who has what? What's abandoned? What aren't you using now? Can you repurpose some stuff? And can you define ownership of everything in your streets? The short answer, I think, is yes. Look around for partners, and then look around. There's plenty of free money to help cities do this with right now. As I mentioned, Centennial, we got literally, I'd like to say millions of dollars. I know in the Springs we got millions of dollars to do this, and the excess capacity can be used for other purposes once the feds help you or the state helps you put that all in. I'll quote Albert Einstein here briefly. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. So with Albert Einstein, don't focus so much on the solutions. Think about understanding the problem. What's the situation? Where's this going? What can you do? And what we like to share with our folks is it's kind of a 5-step process. It starts really with visioning. I'll talk about that. Midterm, from fiber to broadband. You know, not every city will want to do broadband. That's okay. We think every city, though, should very definitely do the fiber. You can do fiber. You can fiberize your city without having to take the next step into broadband. But to understand the difference, we strongly suggest do a visioning process first. Understand what's important to your city. What do you have? What do you need? How's your backhaul? What role should the city government, if any, play in broadband? What role, if any, should the city play in fiber? And those are two distinctly different questions. You can run a feasibility study. I'll tell you right now, everyone's different. Costs vary there. This is a typical one that we're using right now for a client in El Paso County, where we're doing a visioning study for them, and then we'll hopefully jump into feasibility and help them understand, okay, you definitely have fiber. You want to use your fiber. Can you make money at it? Is it worth doing? But overall, what's the role for government? Is there a role for government? And that varies by every city. I can't tell you right now what works in Thornton may not work in Pagosa Springs. Everybody is different. But you should look at this stuff, understand the pros, cons, costs, risks, and what's all involved here. And then lastly, back to George's point from a little while ago, look at those smart city technologies. These things are not just smart projects one by one. Think big picture, long term. These are smart programs, and we like to talk about a technology roadmap. Remember the cars and, okay, well, what about garages? What about parking? What about? What we like to talk about is when you look at doing the smart city or technology roadmap or smart city strategic plan, we like to suggest look at what the emerging technologies are. What are the consequences of that to your town? What's the impact of that? And then what are the secondary consequences? And then how does that relate? There's a little iterative loop there. That's that angle upward. We keep looking at consequences, cumulative impact, and secondary consequences until you figure out for the city of Westminster or wherever you are, this is where we think these technologies are going. This is the strategy development piece that we want to take. Should we monitor it? Should we position ourselves, or should we take action now for where this goes? So again, I think overall, begin with the end in mind. Do the visioning first, planning, design, build. You can operate it if you want. And then a couple of last slides here. Do achieve some clarity on your vision and goals. We'd strongly suggest internal to your city, appoint a cross-functional city fiber team. Pull in somebody from Public Works, from utilities, from IT, from the GIS side, from the city manager's office, and economic development. Very important. Partner with everybody that has any interest in this. Other keys that we find are economic development can be huge advocates for this. Seek every penny that's out there, and there are millions across the state that are out there immediately. Look to create something that's sustainable. And this sounds like a shameless plug. Sorry, Lisa. You can't identify a trusted advisor to walk you through the complex issues out there. How's that for a non-plug? Okay. Anyway, but I think the really fiber is tomorrow's cash cow. And then financing alternatives. There's plenty of money out there. DOLA and DORA, I know you folks at CML, Lisa, are intimately involved in a lot of that. I just sat through a DORA meeting where they passed out $7 million in DORA funds, and DOLA also has millions of dollars to help cities down this path. So With that, I guess the last plug here is a picture of Buena Vista. Great little town. We've helped them a little bit there. Some new legislation. I know you folks at CML were helpful in some new legislation that the governor signed middle of last year that now allows a local improvement district. If you're doing broadband or fiber, small counties across the state, anything less than 60,000 population, can now use an LID, a local improvement district, for broadband purposes. In addition to setting up an enterprise, in addition to special districts or metro districts, state law now allows LIDs. And so it's the same financing mechanism that a small town would use for an alley paving or sidewalk paving. You can use now that same exact methodology as of 6 months ago to create broadband stuff for your community. So just to recap, you can do stuff immediately. You can do fiberize your city short term. You can look at broadband, do your visioning first, then feasibility, and then lastly, long term, this is all going to become a smart city. Do a technology assessment. Like it or not, buckle up, because that's where we're going. So there we go. How's that? Lisa,
wow.
Over to you. Shush.
Fantastic. That was great information. So at this point, we'll certainly take some questions. If anyone has any, simply type them in, and we'll get to them. I'll give you a minute to do that. While you're doing that, I do want to give a plug to our annual conference, June 19th through 22nd. It's going to be in Vail this year, and we do have a limited number of scholarships available. So if you're interested, those are due February 9th. CML.org, click under the Events Annual Conference tab, and you'll get the application to apply for a scholarship. Somebody did ask the question if we could provide the URL to the recording of this video, of this webinar. CML.org, under Events, you'll see Training Materials, and it will be posted there. So Dave and George, there is a question. Is there any hope in getting the FCC to recognize that DSL should never be considered broadband? In other words, without symmetrical up and down speeds above 25 or even 50, it's just not really broadband.
Well, I wish I could say the answer were yes. As I mentioned here a little while ago, I think sadly, to some of us who are broadband advocates, the current administration is actually going backwards. They're going to lower the bar. So now, as I mentioned, where broadband is 25 and 3, I've heard as low as 10 and 1 may become the new definition of broadband. And so some people are saying that they're solving the broadband problem. So few people have broadband in the country. Let's reduce the threshold for what broadband is defined as. So much as I'd love to say yes, it's a brilliant idea. I wish I could say we could do that. The reality is I think that under the current FCC, you'll probably see a reduction in the threshold, and there'll be more people have broadband only because we've changed what the definition of broadband is.
Another question, 300 feet seems to be a short distance for installing repeaters. Do you see any options for the more rural areas that cannot depend on the 300-foot streetlight install?
Short answer is absolutely yes. I won't bore the audience with terms like point to multi-point transmitters, and there's quite a number of technologies out there that do exist. The key thing that we find is the backhaul. And what a lot of the rural cities don't quite understand is that you probably have rights right now. If somebody, one of the large incumbent telecoms, owns fiber optic cable down a state highway right away, let's say into Durango, chances are you have, by state law, you have access to capacity on that fiber. So yes, a lot can be done. A lot of it will look like wireless, and the technologies are evolving. And definitely, again, that's part of what we talk about doing our visioning and our feasibility work. We need to look at that. Everybody's different because backhaul technologies, everybody's different. But the short answer is yes, absolutely. You can get a lot of it, and this stuff doesn't cost a lot of money.
Great. Any other questions? Feel free to type them in. Again, we so appreciate Dave and George's participation, everyone for participating in today's webinar. Certainly some great information shared. We do have another question. What can we do to educate the powers that be about the broadband definition?
There's some stuff online. I could even find a couple of articles out there that talks about the definition, what it was until 2015, what it became in 2015, and there's a lot of buzz now with this net neutrality thing and the FCC getting tangled up with the future of the internet. As I mentioned, the ironic twist to this is that with the FCC now potentially redefining broadband, with the FCC now turning back the clock on net neutrality, those cities who want to get involved in the broadband business, as I mentioned, you don't have to play by those net neutrality rules. You can buy your internet service by the streaming gigabit per second, and you can define the rules. So if you want to give priority to streamers, gamers, high technology companies, whomever they are, once you decide that you're going to be providing that service, you provision it and you can define it as you want to. And so the rest of the world can go off playing net neutrality games. You wouldn't have to necessarily play by those games if you buy it in bulk.
And the question says, no, how do we educate Congress about the realities of the definition?
Get a hold of Lisa, you're in the political advocacy business. You want to take that one?
No, sir, I do not. John Clark, that's a great question, and I could certainly talk to my colleagues who handle this situation from the lobbying standpoint and get back to you on that. Will 5G eliminate the need for fiber?
Actually, quite the opposite, George. Maybe you want to talk about that a little bit, but yeah, actually quite the opposite. 5G, from everything we're seeing, actually will require fiber to these node points, but the node points will be 300-foot spacing possibly. So the network architecture, as it's called, will change dramatically. Right now we're encouraging people to have fiber into every house and into every utility meter. That is certainly the best long-term thing to do. But when 5G comes along, if you have a fiber optic cable to the street light that you have the line of sight to, and you're pulling 5G, you're pulling gigabit speed wirelessly into your cell phone in 5 to 8 years, you'll need fiber to the streetlight. But depending on how fast you need, if you want to stream 4K or 8K TV, you're probably still going to need fiber. It's 300 feet away. Put it into the house. It's several hundred, maybe $1,000 per house to bring a fiber optic strand in. But yeah, you'll probably still need fiber in your neighborhood. The question is exactly what does the architecture look like? Streetlights versus grandma's ONT or optical network terminal box on the side of the house. That's to be determined.
Great. Wonderful. Well, George and Dave's information is on the screen, so feel free to reach out to them if they can be of any further assistance. As, of course, feel free to reach out to CML if we can assist you in any way. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.